the high-level conference on National Drought Policy marked a paradigm change in the approach that we take to drought management. In developing strategies for an integrated and proactive approach to disaster risk reduction instead of crisis response. Partnerships were formed then and have grown throughout the past 10 years. But given the increasing challenges and impacts that we see on the ground, we still see a huge need to step up our game. So 10 years after the first milestone, we are organizing a follow-up conference in 2023, another high-level conference, a high-level meeting on national drought policy and action. It is going to be assessing our progress, seeing what we've learned, and what we need to go forward.
Yes, Katrin, and also welcome from my side. So this session is actually going to be a consultation. We won't have big presentations, and we hope it's not, it's about drought, but it's not going to be dry. So here in Stockholm is currently probably so much water and knowledge gathered, and also knowledge about what happens if you don't have water, and that anywhere in the world. And we want to take advantage of that and bring this information into the process of preparing this this conference that Katrin just mentioned. So the acronym is HMNDP plus 10. It's very difficult at the beginning. We got used to it so far, but so we'll call it plus 10 from now on. And the process is really an open process, and every input from the community and above all the stakeholders that had something to say on drought are really welcome, and we need this input very much. So during the session we will ask you questions, and we hope we can start some of the discussions that we then want to continue in way more depth at the conference next year. And yeah, these discussions are of course urgently needed, as Katrin has just explained, in this context of accelerating drought risk in so many places in the world. And we have seen during the preparation of this session, when we came together with, I think, more than 10 different organizations, that there were already great discussions. So already this small group has really initiated a lot of discussion. So we're really looking forward to this session to hear from you. And yeah, but first, of course, we want to provide you with an overview what actually happened 10 years ago at this first high-level meeting on national drought policy in 2013, but also to see what happened so far for the preparation of the Plus 10 conference next year. And for that, I would like to ask Bob Stefanski from the World Meteorological Organization. Bob, and he was a veteran of the conference 10 years ago, or he is a veteran of the conference 10 years ago, to provide us with this overview. Please, Bob, the floor is yours.
Great. If we could have show the slides, so I can go to the next one. Can we? I don't see. Yeah, very good. Perfect. Perfect. So as Valentin said, we had this meeting in March of 2013. And again, I'm going to be very short here because as Valentin and Katrin said, we really want to get your input on things. Oh, great. That's perfect. So this was in March of 2013. We had over 400 participants from 87 countries. The key message there was helping countries move from reactive to proactive drought policies. And I think the key theme in the organization of this meeting and the one next year is the collaboration amongst all the international and regional and national organizations. So the key co-sponsors were WMO, UNCCD, and FAO back then, but I have to really, again, say we had also many others, United Nations University, the AFRC, you can see Convention on Biological Diversity, et cetera. The Global Water Partnership, very important. So again, that was a key point. Next slide, please. So we had a scientific segment, and you can see there, we had 9 sessions looking at some breakout groups, poster sessions. But the key on here is this focus on the continuity, if you will, from 10 years ago to now. We still have Don Wilhite, you can see there on the top, myself, many other colleagues, Mark Svoboda, and Roger Pawarti, sort of a younger look at all of us. So the key point here is that we want to continue this discussion of what happened 10 years ago and see how we can move forward. So next slide. Again, we had two sessions, a scientific session and a policy session. And with the scientific session, we had many documents. We will share these slides with you. Also, there is a slide, there's a link there, the community.wmo, which is a link where you can find all this information. You're looking at compendium of best practices, vulnerability impact assessment, drought monitoring, mitigation, etc. And for some of people who are currently involved, you can see these same themes to this day. So again, this meeting in 2013 was the start of these activities and a coalition of even things that were going on in the previous 10 years of before 2013. Next slide, please. Again, the policy documents, again, the essential elements of national drought management policy should include, and you can see they're highlighted in green. Those are the three pillars that we use today: monitoring, early warning, vulnerability impact assessment, and preparedness and mitigation. So this is the roots of the three pillars. Again, I want to focus on the policy session. We have the Prime Minister of Niger. They're shaking the hands of the then Executive Secretary of UNCCD. We had high-level political people, the Prince of Orange from the Netherlands, and of course, heads of UN agencies and conventions of Luc Nada from UNCCD, and at the time, Michel Giraud from WMO, among others. So that was the policy side and the policy documents. Next slide, please. And just wrapping up, a lot of discussions, but I think importantly, you can see the origins of the three pillars. And we had a declaration, again, developing proactive drought mitigation, drought impact mitigation, preventative and planning measures, risk management, etc. Promote greater collaboration to enhance the quality of all the observing networks and delivery systems. Improve public awareness of drought risk and preparedness for drought. Next, please. Consider, where possible, legal frameworks in each country, economic instruments, financial strategies. Establish emergency relief plans based on sound management, making sure that if we do any action right now, that we don't leave countries more vulnerable to the next drought. And of course, link drought management plans to local and national development policies. Again, everything is on that link that I shared below, and you can find this presentation also online. Next slide, please. So just a reminder, if you will, so the launch of several initiatives back in 2013, we have the Integrated Drought Management Program, which continues. We have the National Drought Management Policy Initiative from the UN Water Decade for Capacity Development, which is now going on to do other things. But again, we have very good initiatives there, also the World Day to Combat Desertification. So again, that's the origin of several things that happened 10 years ago. And so colleagues, the next slide, please. Our challenge is, what do we do for the meeting next year? So this is the quick background of how things started 10 years ago. And the rest of this session today is talking about possible ways forward and what's needed. And this is where we need your input. I just want to state that we're looking at, again, the +10 sometime in September, October of next year, with possible subtitles of moving from policy to action and using knowledge. You can see the various institutions involved already. We have an international organizing committee. We've had several meetings already, and we presented this at the UNCCD COP back in Cote d'Ivoire in May. So with that, I want to leave it to the group and send it back to Valentine and Catherine. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much, Bob, for this enlightening and comprehensive overview of the 2013 conference and where we're thinking of going. So this next section now will discuss the topics that the 2023, the Plus 10 conference will address. These topics will be presented by members of the International Organizing Committee, and we will need your input. So after each of the short statements that the experts will make, they will also pose a question to the audience. We will give you some time to reflect during these contributions, and then after the 6 contributions, we will come back to the audience and pose these questions again and hope to engage in a discussion with you. So the first speaker today is Mark Swoboda. Mark, please come up to the stage here. And he to address the 3 pillars of integrated drought management.
Thanks, Katrin. Pleasure to be here. It was a pleasure to be a part of the first meeting almost 10 years ago. And I found it very hard to distill 9 years into one slide, but that's the charge, in 3 minutes to boot. So try to cover a lot of ground here in a short amount of time. But I think one of the fundamental things that came out of that meeting was indeed this 3-pillar process that Bob just touched on. Building off the work of Dr. Don Wilhite's work in drought risk management over the last several decades, distilling that all down into 3 principal pillars that you see here. A lot of attention typically given to early warning and monitoring. And I've just put a smattering, a collage of products that have come out. And I want you to note that, while Bob showed the original organizers, you can see that many, many entities are now on the same page. I think this is the key point of the 3 pillars, is we're talking the same language finally, and not in our silos. So FAO, UNCCD, WMO, International Water Management Institute, the National Drought Mitigation Center, we're all talking around the same principles of how we deal with drought. And lots of different pathways to get there, not prescriptive, but you can see a lot of guidance and reference material, working with people on the ground. All these documents that have come out now really fundamentally started with this meeting 9 years ago. More recently too, I think you can see it starting to come through the COPs and through these other initiatives, drought initiatives that are underway, particularly recently with UNCCD, for example. I list here on the right side of the slide, they're starting to invest a lot of, there's the silent D on UNCCD, the other D being drought. So it's the other D. It's now one of the Ds instead of the other D. And I'm glad to see that because how we deal with drought is really a microcosm of how we can deal with climate change. Of all the hazards, it has the largest spatial footprint, up to potentially millions of hectares, multi-regional issues, transboundary issues on water, differences in vulnerability and risks nationally, subnationally, regionally, and of course, how we deal with that in mitigation and policy varies. So again, it's never a prescriptive approach, but now we have a lot more information to share with people. We've brought health into the game a little bit more. Glad to see that. UNCCD also had their first ever drought day in coordination with the desertification day this year in Madrid, Spain. And they have new initiatives going forward. So the other things I'll close with, one of the, outside of the coordination role of IDMP, which is very inclusive and involves many folks, and there's still room at the table for more, I think. The science policy interface is another area that's been invested in over the last, less than a decade now, of how we translate science to policymakers, how we translate science to the public in ways that they can find it usable and integrated into their decision-making, resource management, et cetera, and the intergovernmental working groups. So we're phasing into the intergovernmental working group 2 activities over the next 2 years. as we head into the next HDMP next year. So again, just wanted to, the website there is on the bottom. You saw it on Bob's slide, and I'll reiterate that point, and thanks for your time. So the question I do want to end with, just to plant a seed, and you may have other questions as you look at this, is I don't know how many of you in the room are familiar with this three-pillar approach, but now that you've heard what these three pillars are, we'd just like you to reflect and be able to potentially share during the open Q&A session. Have you been involved in any of these three pillars individually, with your institution, or with your country? And with that, I'll pass it back to Katrin. Thank you.
Well, our in this session is Erwin Denise, who will be talking about the finance.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Catherine. So can I see the slide, please? So the theme that I'm going to talk about, which is front and center, is the economic and financial impacts of droughts on countries, economies, and people. And over the last decades, at least 1.43 billion people have been adversely affected by droughts. Now, combined with floods, droughts have caused over 750 billion in recorded damages, which is close to $1 trillion. So the economic costs have been really staggering, and the social costs even higher, as the poor and the marginalized are disproportionately affected. Now, looking back at the last decade, at the last 10 years, we've seen progress on several fronts. First, making the case for investing in drought preparedness, especially via the economic terms and the economic approach. And some of you may be familiar with the Bacci report, which is the benefits of action and the cost of inaction for drought preparedness and mitigation. The basically development of a methodological approach to look at the benefits of actions and the cost of inaction, and to really support this shift from the reactive approach to a more proactive and risk-based approach towards drought. A second point that has basically seen progress is the financing across all the three pillars that Mark just mentioned of integrated drought risk management, but more is needed, and in particular on the second pillar of risk and impact assessment, risk layering mechanisms, policy and governance. So more is needed on those ones. And finally, understanding that institutional capacity, coordination and collaboration is really a rate limiting step for progress on drought preparedness, that there is a need for more practicable guidance on how to foster and sustain this collaboration within and across governments. And I make here reference to the EPIC response, which is an interesting perspective that looks at floods and droughts not as independent events, but rather as different ends of the same hydroclimatic spectrum that is inextricably linked. So it provides this comprehensive framework to look at droughts and floods in an integrated way, and to help national governments to have a whole of society effort to manage these risks and to reduce the social, economic and environmental costs of droughts and floods. So those are some thoughts on the economic and financial aspects, and we would love to hear from you and to have feedback, particularly on this question on what approaches should be pursued over the next 10 years for financing these investments that are needed to strengthen drought preparedness. Thank you, and back to you, Catherine and Valentin.
Well-deserved applause. And so, yeah, just keep in mind the question. So what do we need to do in terms of finance for the coming years for drought preparedness and resilience? So the next speaker that is also going to talk to us online is Cohen Verbist.
Good morning, everyone. So yes, I will be talking a bit more about the governance and what has happened
Hi,
over the
Cohen.
last. Yes, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, the floor is
Okay,
yours.
perfect. Okay, thank you so much. So I just want to highlight a few points on the governance aspects. So of course, since HMNDP in 2013, we've seen huge progress in streamlining drought policies into drought management plans and strategies. But of course, there have been new challenges emerging, and which we should reflect on and also see how we can bring them more centrally into the governance framework. So on one hand, of course, we've seen emerging a lot of governance approaches over the different continents, taking into account the messages that have come out of the MNDP. But we also see, for example, after evaluating those governance approaches, for example, the Drought Atlas we did a few years ago, looking at 10 countries in Latin America, we also have to see how effective they were in addressing the droughts. And one of the things we've seen, for example, emerging over the last decade is that we are facing more and more mega droughts, as they've been termed in literature. And I just give a few examples. In Chile is already battling more than 10 years with subsequent droughts, one year more impactful than others. But of course, the combination of those long droughts cause concern, for example, for day zero conditions, which have been averted in the city of Cape Town only just a few years ago. So we see that those challenges are emerging, and the question is, are our governance systems able to cope with these very intensive, very long droughts? Another issue we've seen emerging is flash droughts, where of course we have very quick onset compared to the long-term onset. And these severe events are in fact due to a combination of water stress, but also to heat waves, high temperatures and high evaporative demand. So that actually also puts a pressure on how we deal with droughts. Another element which has been merged as well is that, of course, human activities is part of the drought issue, but it also creates feedback loops that need to be taken into account. And we need to put on management practices that actually also address those feedback loops that may increase drought intensification and propagation. And of course, climate change is accelerating its impacts. And we see the severity increase in the recurrence, but also the impact of those droughts. So we need to include climate change really into our drought risk management, and especially addressing how the uncertainty of projections and how the impact might be felt differently across the globe should be taken into account in our management strategies. And UNESCO has been moving forward with an approach called climate risk informed decision analysis, exactly to bring that discussion more to the front and ensuring we look at the medium to long term in our drought risk planning. We also see that drought management is often top-down, it's government-led, while of course the question is how can you reach the last mile, bring in our local communities in drought risk management and governance. So there's also a need to bring in the bottom-up approaches into the picture and also see how we can bring citizen science more actively in drought risk management going forward. So just for you to reflect on, I just had another question to you, is that how do you see climate change affect the way we adjust our drought governance as we're moving into conditions that exceed the recent historical record and therefore putting pressure on existing governance systems? Thank you.
Much, Cohen, and yeah, really very pertinent question, and really also a good way to draw how climate change is really challenging our ways of governance for drought resilience. So the next speaker I'm going to introduce is going to talk about social inclusion, and this is Rihanna Gonzalez.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Can you hear me perfectly? Great. And the slide is up. And I think this is definitely a good segue from Cohen's presentation in terms of how do we get communities more involved. So what I'd like to share with you, and thank you for having me here today, I'll do my best to share with you the importance yet complex area of social inclusion in drought management and the importance of a more humanistic approach moving forward. So young women, children, and young people, elderly and the indigenous are some of the most vulnerable to the impacts of drought. Yet they are sometimes left out of the conversations when designing solutions and adaptation measures. When this occurs, it is more than likely the solutions implemented are not designed to fit the needs of the people it was meant to support or not fully accepted within the community, highlighting a disconnect between decision makers and the beneficiaries. However, as droughts become more frequent and intense, as previous speakers have identified, the urgency for communities to become more resilient to droughts is becoming more crucial. There's an untapped potential when it comes to drought management and inclusion, as women and young people, though some of the most impacted, are also among the most capable in leading the fight to become more resilient. The impacts of drought go beyond water and can impact education, livelihoods, health, including mental health, lifestyle, and even disrupt political systems. Women and young people, who are also a significant percentage of the global population, are mobilizing and empowering themselves and communities through education, capacity building, and implementing their own actions on the ground, thus becoming leaders and change makers in their own right. I'll just like to highlight some of the community-based examples. One from my home country in Trinidad, the Fonzaman Reforestation Program. Since 1982, this organization has begun a movement of community members being led by women, working together to eradicate the annual threat of forest fires due to harsh dry seasons, and now because of impending droughts that we have that are more common. To date, the NGO has evolved and the additional activities are being undertaken, including reforestation, forest fire prevention and suppression, organic seedling propagation, and implementation of surface water management systems, as well as getting involved into national decision-making and education awareness programs. And it facilitates a regional and international student exchange program while implementing ecosystem services. The aim is that this NGO will then eventually become a sustainable social enterprise. Within West Africa, there's a Ton Future Ton Climat project that GWP is supporting that allows the youth of the region in the countries Benin, Burkina Faso, and Togo to carry out actions for adaptation, particularly connected to agriculture, so drip irrigation, reforestation, agroforestry, and advocacy actions at high levels on the nexus of water security and peace, in connections with youth-based results and surveys that they put forward at national consultation, showing that youth are not just about advocacy, but they're also innovators and can add to the decision-making process. A final one I would add is the Friends of Water. It's a volunteer network around 1,000 women working across Bundikal, India to rehabilitate and revive disappeared water sources. Together they carry rocks, they mix concrete and build dams and pools, catchments and embankments to catch the rain from the June monsoon. Their work has helped them retain monsoon rainwater for longer and revive half a dozen water bodies around their village. So my question to you, the audience, is that for the past decade, we have stated that we will leave no one behind, and we have not been able to meaningfully stay true to this. What are we doing wrong, and how can we improve the level of social inclusion in drought management? Thank you. Back to you, Catherine.
So thank you very much, Rihanna, and thank you very much for these highlights on social inclusion and also the examples that you brought. I am moving on to the next speaker, who is going to talk about ecological issues, and that is Rachel McDonald. She's here, and yeah, welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Katrin. We have heard already today about billions of dollars of loss of infrastructure, of the lives that are impacted. But there are very few figures, if anything, that tells you about the ecosystems, the loss of species, the loss of ecosystem functioning that comes from droughts. In Europe, these pictures are from Europe for this summer, but they could also be at many places of the world. What happens when a drought comes? We get a loss of habitat of many types, terrestrial habitat. So this is your forest fires that have been raging in France. That's a picture of the Po River in Italy, like this major river. There's not many fish living there. There's not many macroinvertebrates living there. And you can think about the destruction of that forest fire that was there. And then this lower picture is of many of our rivers, so many of our aquatic ecosystems are impacted by water pollution. We have treated sewage or often untreated sewage flowing into those rivers. So what happens when that river is now very dry? You're having very polluted waters going again there, again attacking the ecosystems. So we can see that the ecological impacts of droughts rarely considered in any detail, but are extensive. And what we also know, there are some of the indirect impacts. So we have our drought, we have our forest fire, and then comes the rains. And the sediment washes off into our river systems, in our near-coastal systems, again, stifling ecosystems. And when we had the loss of growth up there, we were changing carbon and nutrient cycling. So we're going from our ecosystems being carbon sequestrating organisms to being carbon releasing organisms, again, affecting everything. When we were asked for this session, we were given 3 minutes. We had to say, what was the challenge? What has the progress been made in the last 10 years? And some ideas from going forward. I would argue that the progress made in terms of bringing ecology into our drought management planning and our drought management thinking has been very limited. We're having to focus on infrastructure and people and agriculture and water resources. Where does environment come into all of this? And we, at the EMI, we've been working in Jordan, Morocco, and Lebanon. We've been helping write drought plans. So we've been taking the Pillar 2 vulnerability and impact assessments and taking these into Pillar 3, the drought action plans. And we work with our stakeholders there, and they have to prioritize where the governments will respond when a drought is there. Environment's 5 or 6 or 7, understandably. So what I'd say is progress has been very little, and I think that ecological systems have paid a high price. So how are we going to change that? What can we do? Well, we're seeing a real acknowledgement of the role of ecosystem services and the fact that there are investments coming in through impact investments, ESG. We've got to be able to take the inflows of money that's coming into there and invest in bankable solutions, ecological solutions. We don't have enough research on that. So in terms of what can we take to +10, let's get ecology on there, because what we're seeing more and more is ecology is critical for everything, of all this functioning. And my question to you is, maybe I'm giving a very negative picture. Do you know of management practices that are given a high priority to protecting ecological systems? And what were the successful arguments used to support that, to get that into that policy process? Thank you very much.
Yeah, food for thought, I would say. Thank you very much, Rachel. Yeah, and just remember that question. And we're looking forward to hearing about any ideas on how ecology can be lifted up in this whole discussion on resilience and finance as well. My next speaker is Adam Fish. Hi, Adam. He's joining us online, and he's going to speak about the role of disaster risk reduction. The floor is yours.
Good morning. Thanks, Katrin. Nice to see you all. I wish I was there with you. I work for UNDRR, and that's the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Risk reduction as a verb is not very obvious. A lot of people, when they think about disaster risk reduction, they think about the disasters. In fact, they think about the hazards, about floods and storms and droughts and volcanoes. And what we've been trying to do is to get to the point where we are thinking about more than just hazards, that there are lots of other drivers of disasters and of disaster risk. And we do this so that member states can plan and finance and govern in ways that do reduce risk, that they can make those investments in ways that address the vulnerabilities, address the exposed assets, and hopefully combat some of the drivers of the hazards. UNDRR and the disaster risk community have been maturing in the way that we understand hazards. Flood risk models have become much more mature and developed. Seismic models are very interesting right now, storms, and indeed droughts as well. But the drought community, I have to say, has done much more. I think it sort of goes without saying now when you talk about droughts, that hazard is the physical part, but droughts are more than just about whether water is there or not. And we've heard some of these examples already. It relates to land use and ecosystems and erosion and absorption and traditions and livelihoods and energy and social vulnerability and habitats and migration and food and health. And all of these things are part of what drives drought risk, but also the way droughts are manifest in impact. And for this, I really like using drought as an example. And I like building on the lessons that this community has developed over the past 10 years, hopefully that we'll look at exciting new advances that we can inspire other hazard communities, other communities thinking about disaster risk to draw from. Last year, UNDRR published the GAR, the Global Assessment Report, special report on drought with the help of many of the panelists you're hearing from today, and probably several of you in the room. And in a way, that report and the work from our friends at UNCCD and others related to drought tries to demonstrate through lived case studies, through examples, the breadth of the experience of drought and the way that it's manifest and the way that the impacts are felt and the way that the drivers are common across multiple contexts. What we saw in that report, though, is that drought is not only drought, and that drought risk reduction is actually really disaster risk reduction, and disaster risk reduction is really resilience building. So we're all sort of in the same channel. And again, I really want to draw on the drought community because I think that it's showing how to take a broader and more inclusive perspective. In fact, I can read the GAR special report on drought and mentally erase the word drought in most cases, and it still makes plenty of sense because it really is about risk reduction in general. Future guidance of drought risk management must maintain this expansive approach and seek to push other communities and inspire other communities by really taking that broad, inclusive, holistic perspective. Because by showing drought risk management is also flood risk management, it's also epidemic risk management, it's also famine risk management and energy shortfall management and ecosystem management. It really is about everything. So I guess I'm wishing that the future versions of this paradigm do sort of maintain that level of inclusivity and participation and long-term thinking, because I think that so far that's why drought is the most mature and most interesting community when it comes to sort of starting from a hazard and thinking about how to reduce risk. The question I'd like to ask you to think about is to think about the number of people and regions and sectors that have experienced drought and related impact. This is in the billions, right? Like at least half the world has some experience with drought and its impact. How can we best harness this wide familiarity with drought as a hazard, or as a risk rather, to engage more actors in addressing the drivers of drought-related risk? I think there's a big possibility to harness some of the experiences of those billions to get them involved also in drought risk reduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adam, and thank you to all the speakers. I think this was quite impressive to see that, first of all, there has something really happened during the last 10 years. We really came from reaction to a proactive approach to this focus on resilience that Adam also just mentioned, but I think not everywhere, and we've also seen that several of the sectors are really lacking behind. And we still need to do a lot more, and we really need to set this agenda now, because otherwise it will be too late in many places. So as we said, we want also to tap more into the knowledge of the room here, which I'm sure is excellent. And I think you have seen this in other sessions. We have prepared a POLEF, and I would like to ask my colleague to bring the POLEF up here to the screen. So everybody, please get your phones and go to Polef, or yeah, or you just use the either scan this QR code or go to polef.com/GWP. So yeah, I'll just wait a little bit. So it's either you have scanned it. If it was not, can you go back? Oh, people start already. So for all the people that couldn't scan the code, please go to polef.com/GWP. Polef, POLLEV.com/GWP. But I'm seeing already a lot of results there. And yeah, you have seen, you see here again, all the 6 themes that we are currently thinking about for this big conference next year. And of course, there are many other aspects, and we will talk about this hopefully now with you. But we just wanted to see what you think, which of the themes that were just presented need most of the attention during the next period, which are really left behind most. And yeah, I think this came also through the presentations. It's really the social inclusion and the ecological issues, and yeah, also the finance one, which is an overarching one. But I think you could frame all of these as overarching for the other themes. So this is really this integrated approach that we need. So I thank you very much for your input here. We'll, when we have time, we will have another Polef at the very end. But for now, I'll give it back to Katrin and Daniel Tsegai from UNCCD, from the Convention to Combating Drought, I say now. And they will moderate the discussion with you. So over to you.
Yeah, so Daniel, please exactly. That's the new D that you're pushing forward at the convention.
Great. I'm also very, very glad to be here with you today, and I'm one of those who were in 2013 talking about drought, and we are a kind of a family now, and it is a very good opportunity for us now to expose beyond the family, because we have been discussing this drought for the last 10 years, maybe among a few of us, about 15 or 20 of us. So we are here to learn from you. It's a kind of a peculiar session to me, because this is going to drive the kind of work that we do for the next 10 years or even more. So you have heard Mark talking about the 3 pillars. To remind you, they are about early warning and monitoring system, vulnerability and risk assessment to drought, and also the drought risk mitigation measures, the action. So he discussed these 3 pillars. So are you familiar with or involved personally, institutionally, or nationally with these drought activities across any of the 3 pillars? So I just want to hear from you. Please just let us know your experience on any of these 3 pillars. We will not have much time. I think we will have probably 3 to 4 minutes for each question. So I would be grateful to any volunteer to tell us something about any of the 3 pillars. You can raise your hands. There are microphones here.
And also just for the technical part, we probably also have some comments online. We'll try to address those as well.
So do you need us to elaborate it maybe? Or the 3 pillars are, one is on early warning and monitoring systems. It's not about predicting and forecasting. It's also about communicating the alert, analyzing the risk, and disseminating the information to the end user. So it is the whole spectrum of the monitoring end to end. The other one is vulnerability assessment, kind of drought risk profile, mapping who is going to be affected when drought strikes and why. So some countries, like for example Ethiopia, I was once there, and they have a good map of vulnerability on who is going to be affected when drought strikes, then they know where to act and whom to support. And the other pillar was on drought risk mitigation measures. So any experience on this, and your familiarity is very important for us when we move beyond these 3 pillars.
Or if you want anything, any clarification, Mark, of course, is also still here. Any question from the audience to Mark is also very much welcome.
So this is Jesse Bell, University of Nebraska Medical Center. vulnerability, it's one of the areas I work in, trying to understand how vulnerability, especially associated with drought, especially in the context of human health. One of the things I'm really interested in is how vulnerability changes. A lot of times we look at vulnerability as though it's a static system. And that's one of the questions I have for you, because one of the things that we did recently was look at vulnerability across the United States associated with drought, and notice that even if over a short period of time, communities that were potentially vulnerable changed between even over a decade period.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. I think you're spot on there. I think the challenge today with a warming planet is not only is the climate dynamic and fluid and changing, the idea of stationarity is out the window, right? But the underlying vulnerabilities are also very fluid and changing. With a growing planet, more straws in the drink, competing for water, this is making it even more challenging for us to accurately sort of map and address that. So your point's very well taken. So that's how I would respond to it in quick form.
What we also see is that drought is always seen to be a threat multiplier. There are underlying conditions, poverty, access, all those things that everybody knows in this room. And then along comes the drought. We're seeing this Ukraine crisis. People are being pushed below the poverty thresholds. And then if a drought then comes along, their ability to respond and to be able to deal with that drought becomes different. So it's highly variable. It's not just the climate that's changing. There are so many other stresses into that system. So it's hard. And I mean, one of the things that we've been, at EME, we've been using the 3 pillars for the last 5-10 years. And what I find very useful is when I'm talking to a policymaker, a government official, it's clear. You've got pillar 1, pillar 2, pillar 3. People understand what we're going to do, why we're going to do it, and why they're needed across all of them together. And the simplicity is so critical for communication and getting government people on board. But as scientists and as practitioners here, we know it's much more complicated than that. And that's the difficult bit. It's balancing the clarity with the complexity.
I'll add one other quick comment. And a couple of the speakers alluded to it. I think Adam did, and maybe Erwin did. And that is, it's not just about water quantity, it's about water quality, which brings in the health element, which I know you work in that arena. So I think it just shows the complexity and how drought is so cross-cutting across so many sectors, and economically as well, that makes it so daunting. And it's why I kind of consider that an analog to how we deal with climate change. So it makes a lot of sense, right, going forward. If we can try to get drought right through these sorts of efforts on disaster risk reduction, perhaps we can be better prepared for the events to come under extreme events and such under climate change.
Thank you, Rachel and Mark. What I would like to add is also we are very, very consistent in terms of our communication on the drought. The 3 pillars, many UN organizations coming together to the country. So I think it resonates to at least, I can witness 70 countries that we have worked with in the UNCCD. But there was another hand, please go ahead.
Hi, Marta Saracen, I'm from Poland. I was involved in developing a draft management plan for Poland. And it is basically based on your 3 pillars, but we are also involved in a huge countrywide campaign. And I'm wondering whether you think about adding this educational pillar, because without stakeholder engagement on many levels, but probably on a local level too, it's hard to do anything. In the perception of drought, it's shifting. The vulnerability assessment is not enough. You need to communicate it countrywide. You need to communicate it on the local level too. So I'm wondering whether you are considering to add an educational part to your 3 pillar.
Thank you. Actually, capacity build, it's embedded in each one of those 3 pillars. So your drought early warning system, this is technical capacity building. And so we would, those of us who work with countries, we would help co-design a system, embed it and train. So then it's operational within a country, within Poland. You generate your own drought maps. When it comes to vulnerability and impact assessment, what's really interesting in many of the countries we've worked at, it doesn't exist. That report, that assessment that we do, that pulls together health and environment and agriculture losses of yields and water losses and all those things like that, and then try and put a number on it, and then try and understand that's the impact, and why is this community, and why is this business vulnerable, and why aren't these? Those reports, we've just put onto our EME website under the MENA Drought Project, 3 reports for Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco. They haven't existed before. So I think there's a sort of a capacity development in terms of understanding the mapping and the bringing together and somehow capturing that vulnerability and impact assessment. And those reports now are used by all sorts of agencies who are trying to tackle that. And then when it comes to policy, this is a completely different set of skills. And it calls to governance. It's about legal systems. It's about actioning policies. But it's often about writing policies. Mark, do you want to talk about your work on the right shops?
Do you want? But otherwise we have to be quicker.
Yeah. Let me speak in general terms. We have a saying, all droughts are local. So therefore, we really want to involve the folks on the ground. That's who are affected, right? You always talk about drought in the context of GDP. I think you lose the true impacts of drought and how devastating they are regionally, subnationally. So education starts there. It's not just the kids and children, it's adults as well, right? So this is very, and that extends into what Rachel was just talking about in terms of policy and planning. That education is always, it's even tougher there because of turnover, rapid turnover of policymakers oftentimes. So, you got to just stay the course and be diligent.
Thank you. I think we are going to move on because we have to also address the other questions, and we will not be, I would like probably to have 1 intervention per question. We call it the elephant in the room, finance. I have dealt with many countries, and the countries always say, where is the finance to deal with drought? So we had also a very good presentation from the World Bank on, the question now is what approach should be pursued over the next 10 years for financing these investment needs so that we can strengthen drought preparedness. So tell us, I think there was a lot of good discussion on business approach and the benefits of action versus the cost of inaction, but there is 1 intervention. John, please go ahead.
Thank you. So John Ikeda, Castalia. I actually prepared a drought finance note for the UNCCD working group on finance last year. And a couple of takeaways that we found, one was drought finance is broader than insurance. I think in the disaster risk reduction space, a lot of times we think about it as an insurance play. It's about managing sovereign risk. It's about self-insurance through government budgets. But thinking about how you finance assets that build resilience against drought and framing finance from other sectors as drought investment. So for example, on the water supply side, building extra reservoir capacity and financing that's something that we're very familiar with. That's a plain vanilla finance. It's not thought of as drought finance necessarily, but using the action plans at the country level to bring together different financing sources that are already there, making sure they're working with each other towards a coherent drought management strategy, finding the money that's available is a really important part of it. The other really interesting point, and we didn't explore this as much in the paper, but I thought, Rachel, your point on nature-based solutions and finding ways to finance that, it's come up in a lot of the sessions, I think, and it's not easy, and I don't know that anybody's really figured out how to do this at scale, even in the US and in Europe. Figuring out how to monetize those benefits, how to capture the value is tough. There's been some work on land value capture, where you use the incremental real estate taxes that are generated through increased value of the land, due to reduced drought, reduced flooding, to finance the investment in that infrastructure, but it's not common, it's not standardized, it hasn't been shown to work at scale yet. And so I think there's a lot more research that's needed, a lot more action pilots in financing nature-based infrastructure, and then specifically thinking about how that can contribute to managing drought risk.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I remember we had a very comprehensive work done by John Ikeda on the financing options for drought for the UNCCD. So you have already alluded to coherence, the nature-based solutions, and the land value, and many aspects. So very important, and financing is bigger than insurance. Now, let me move on to the third question on governance. This is also close to my heart because whatever we do here in this room and beyond has to be beneficial for the end users of this information. When it comes to the early warning and monitoring systems, in many cases, policymakers are aware of what to do, especially when it is El Nino-related drought is predictable, but when it comes to the farmers and pastoralists, this is not the case. So our colleague from UNESCO was talking about how can we integrate them better, kind of a bottom-up approach and citizen science into drought governance to ensure community and engagement at all stages. So how can we really bring this top-down, but also a combined approach with the bottom-up? Any insights into this? Because participation is ownership. If they participate in the planning, they will also participate in the implementation of the process. Yes, Caroline.
Oh, I'll give a quick answer and then maybe there'll be time for someone else too. Just to say that the Kenyan National Drought Management Authority works with schools and they appoint drought ambassadors, and they also work with community groups to regularly monitor resources in drought affected areas. I'm sure many other examples are here, so that's quick.
Thank you, Caroline. This is a very good example from Kenya. Any other insight from anyone? Yes, please. And then we'll move on to the fourth question.
Hello, I'm Zane Marshall from the Southern Nevada Water Authority in Las Vegas, and I sit on a drought advisory committee for the state. And the governor of Nevada has established a drought advisory committee that represents sectors across the state that report on the impacts of drought on a monthly basis, and so that we can see how drought is impacting agriculture and municipalities, small towns, large towns across the entire state on a very regular basis. And if you're familiar with the drought in North America, most of Nevada has been in extreme or excessive drought now for the last couple of years. So it's been very helpful to understand and communicate how drought is impacting from north to south and east and west. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, understanding them, communicating with them on a regular basis is very important. Any reaction from the panelists on the bottom-up approach?
Well, I just want to comment that we have developed a tool to collect these impacts nationally and feed these in from the states. And to me, that's a critical missing piece because it does help us develop a baseline of how impacts today and how that underlying vulnerability is changing for impacts in the future. But it gives decision makers an idea of what they may expect to some degree, but that data really systematically is not collected well enough anywhere. There's some efforts here and in Europe and other places, but we have a long ways to go, and I think that should be held as high as collecting precip and temperature, in my opinion.
Thank you, Mark. We'll
Daniel,
continue
also,
with the fourth question with
okay.
Catherine.
There was a reaction from the panel. Just yeah.
Yeah, sorry, if I can just come in for just 1 second. Yeah, just also highlighting that if we're talking about early action, I think also a very big role as well for communities to be engaged in early action protocols to co-design them. And also one of the things we've been piloting recently is to engage community radios. And I think there's also really a role for communication to be played here to make sure that they're engaged. And of course, schools play a role in that communication. They can be engaged. So a lot of those elements probably need to be brought together a bit closer to make sure communities are actively engaged in drought management. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very good comment on that. So I'm going to go on just in the interest of time integrating the last three questions. So I know that we have two of the three champions here. So that is social inclusion and ecological issues according to your vote as well. And I also think that all of the 6 themes, as said before by other people, are interconnected. So social inclusion, our question is, what are we doing wrong or right? And how can we improve the level of social inclusion? And then the same thing actually is true for ecological issues. So how can we lift up the importance and inclusion of ecological aspects in drought governance? And for DRR, how can we best harness this wide familiarity with drought as a hazard to engage more actors? So here again, inclusion and also ecological aspects in addressing the drivers of drought-related risk. So I'm inviting now contributions on all 3 of these themes. Yeah. Do we have a microphone?
Thank you so much. My name is Imran Sajid. I'm from Bonn University in Germany. So my point was that since we know that climate change accelerates the intensity and frequency of both drought and flood, and drought and floods, they are both sides of one coin. So there is huge potential to turn the flood management measures into drought management. And I can agree that it can depend on local context, but when we consider the watershed management in upstream, midstream, and downstream, and also in most part of the world, groundwater tables are going down, so we have huge potential for natural storage of water into groundwater. So if we consider nature-based solution in upstream, midstream, and downstream of one watershed, then there would be possibility to turn flood management to drought management. And yes, sometimes gray structures like dams, they can prevent small floods, but cannot prevent large floods, such, for example, in case of Pakistan. So I want to hear from panelists what they think. Is there any potential to turn flood management measures to drought management? Thank you.
Thank you. So this is actually about the integration also of multi-hazard. Who wants to take this? Adam?
Sure, I think this is a really exciting question, and this goes to some of what I was talking about in my first intervention, which is that drought risk reduction is disaster risk reduction. You know, investments in, and actually one of my co-panelists mentioned this earlier. You know, the challenge of tagging an intervention as being specifically drought risk reduction becomes challenging when you do treat drought as one of these cross-sectoral, cross-scale questions, where you could say that investing in agricultural water management policy wouldn't necessarily be thought of as drought policy. You would maybe think of that as agricultural policy or development policy, but that's something that could absolutely contribute to the risk reduction of both floods and droughts, probably, and probably also epidemics and other disasters as well. And I think it's at our peril that we become too attached to naming the hazard that we're afraid of. And really, I mean, the drought community has done a great job of this, because it isn't just about the hazard. It isn't just about the physical aspect, but it's considering all of those other drivers, including the social drivers and the livelihood drivers and the sectors that are connected to water use. I think that in a way we're halfway there. Your question is, how can we connect them? How can we make flood management, flood risk management, and drought risk management better aligned? We're halfway there. It's really a question of dispensing with the name of the hazard and thinking about what can we do to build resilience across all sectors, including livelihoods and agriculture and health and planning and urban systems and so on, because all of those things will reduce the risk of or the intensity of eventual hazard events, including drought, including flood.
Thanks. Mark or Irvin? Yes, exactly. So Irvin, do you want to comment?
Yes, sure. No, very good point here. And just to complement, I mentioned the EPIC framework in my intervention, and happy to provide the reference here. So this is really the framework that looks in an integrated way at droughts and floods. And just to give an example, the EPIC, the E stands for enabling. So that looks at the national frameworks for looking together at droughts and floods. The P stands for plan, so planning, flood and drought risk mitigation, contingency planning in an integrated way. The I as invest, so investing in healthy watersheds, as the audience person mentioned, water resources infrastructure, and finally the control part, water allocation, floodplain management. So yes, I mean, a lot of work has gone into helping national agencies to look at droughts and floods in an integrated way, which we call the EPIC framework. Thank you for the question.
Thanks very much, Erwin. And yeah, I mean, as you can see, we're taking notes while you're speaking, so we really want to have more reactions. Please go ahead. Okay. So first, and then you. Okay.
Hi, my name is Natalia. I'm a recent Rotary Peace Fellow from Japan. And because this is a space for ideas, I just wanted to share some of what I observed there. So speaking of multi-hazard approaches, there are checker work of areas that are farm fields in the case of earthquakes that people can run into. But this being soil and this being permeable, it's also a place for recharge. Also amongst residential areas, there are spaces that are interspersed with ponds that are also filled with koi. So these are not heavily engineered systems. They are living systems. So it's a combination of taking care of the ecosystem, connecting the community to it because they can walk and enjoy their way home. So if we are creative and follow systems principles where variety in equals variety out in terms of the complexity of the challenges we're facing and our creativity with how we respond, we could really do a lot, as dire as some of the messages we've been hearing are.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. My name is Marta Salomon. I'm from British Embassy, Ethiopia, and I'm the lead WASH advisor. Currently in UK, supporting together with other partners like African Development Bank, World Bank, UNICEF, and others to support the climate resilient water sanitation implementation. In doing that, we support both financial aid to build resilient infrastructures and also to support resilient post-construction sustainability elements. But in doing that, one of the challenges that we came across, we noticed is the funding. Because in Ethiopia, from the flagship program, based on the mapping they have done, they have about 450 drought-affected waredas. Out of those, 91 are hotspot waredas. And with our pooled fund, we are only supporting about 48 waredas. And the total funding needed for those, only for the hotspots, the 91 waredas is about 6 billion USD. And the funding that we mobilized, some partners, is only about 600 million USD. So I just want to hear from the panelists, because we are currently also supporting to develop a kind of innovative financing, especially focusing on domestic resource mobilization. So to hear any experience on innovative financing, because I don't think we can address with a conventional source of funding like grant, loans, or government funding, if they can shed us some light, some experience so that we can address this huge funding gap. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. And that really also integrates the social inclusion, ecological issues, and then how do we finance. So we're going to have a quick reaction from one of our experts who wants to take this question. Financing Erwin, maybe? Can you hear us?
Yes, no, I can hear you. No, I agree with the question. I mean, it's really we need to look at sources of financing, I mean, from the different sectors involved in drought, whether it's agriculture, water, disaster, risk reduction. And it's really a question that needs to be addressed at the different levels, from national to subnational, and even in some cases in regional perspective. So we need to, that's where we need to make progress indeed over the next years, to look at it in an integrated way and see if there is basically particular buckets also of financing specifically for drought preparedness, that brings together the investments for the different national agencies and subnational entities involved in drought management. Thank you.
Thanks. And a very quick intervention from Rachel.
What we're seeing, I don't know if you've, in Ethiopia, the Green Climate Fund has invested $50 million there to help deal with drought preparedness. And some of this is helping bring in more drought resilient crops, crop breeding, to be able to start to help farmers in particular adjust to these new normals. And it's so that mitigation is important. And so we're looking at lots of types of blended finance. That there's innovation finance, there's obviously aid, but also this international climate finance is going to be important, and how we bring them together to bring real solutions is going to be tricky, complex, but definitely what we have to do.
Thank you. And so we'll have one more very quick question from the audience, but I also invite you to stay in the room and discuss with us after the session, because then we'll have to move on, unfortunately.
Hi. Hi. So Cristina Arango from the utility company of Bogota. Just a quick example on ecological issues and how we deal with them. In Bogota, there's a policy that the utility company has to buy land only for protection. We now have like 33,000 hectares that are devoted for drought prevention and for ecological issues, and it's funded basically by the municipality and by the water utility company, and that's how we do it there.
Very nice example. Thank you very much. So as I said, the time is up. Thank you for all the interventions, and I liked how this got more interactive as time went by. So we'll have another discussion round now, and I'm inviting to the stage now Roger Pulwati and Valentin again. So thanks very much.
Can you please stay? We'll need all the panelists. Daniel, could you also join?
Well, thanks for sticking around, everybody. So right now, I thought we'd be about 20 minutes late. We're only 10 minutes late, so we're 10 minutes ahead.
We won't do the last polyf. We won't do the last polyf.
Yeah, thanks. So we heard a lot of, solutions. We heard a lot of practices. But as people have heard, I was involved in the report Adam mentioned with everybody on this panel. I like to say we have a lot of pilots and no planes, right? We have everybody puts up their hands and say, here's what we're doing. But the question is, are we doing it at scale? Are we doing it in a way that makes society more resilient? Or do we just have some projects? So I'd like to ask the audience to help us here. As we move in this space between risk and resilience, how do we scale up? How do we make sure a lesson is actually learned rather than just identified? Now, many of these lessons are contextual, right? They're based on where we're from. I grew up in the Caribbean. But we have to ask the question, if everything is contextual, how do you scale up? How do we make a resilient nation? So obviously that's not true. There's guidance, there's ways of learning across what we've done. We had 21 cases in the Global Assessment Report, many more in the UNCCD. You've heard a lot of lessons about things and gaps that we don't have, and I'll summarize some of those at the end of this session. But this particular session is, what do we do with the pieces? If governance is about coordination, if governance is about learning, if governance is about equity, and in the HMNDP, our next one, 2023, is going to be about those issues of systemic risk, the way global networks interact, commodities and so on, about understanding and modernizing the view of drought, The threshold, surprises, and cascades matter. And most critically, as a result, different forms of governance is needed. I like to ask the question that one of my mentors always asks, and I say it in almost every talk I get. If we know so much, why aren't we doing better? If we have so many answers, why aren't we doing better? Right? So there's your question. So are the panelists on there? Because I plan to panelize them. The idea is point us in the direction, and I'll come back to some of these. The bases for collaboration. Rachel, for instance, identified the issue of ecosystems and the fact that we point towards things like agriculture. We're not that good on all of that either, and still we have the issue of ecosystems to deal with. So I'm going to pose this first. Any feedback from the panelists?
And I think also what you mentioned, this integration across the sectors that you just were referring to.
The integration question I want to get to,
yeah.
But scaling up is part of integration.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Also
Yeah. So I always like to tell people you don't integrate first and then look for answers, right? The idea is work backwards from the problem and integrate around what you need to answer the question. So give us some insight. We're actually struggling with this. Yes, we need to work across the sectors, but I don't want a recommendation, oh, we need to break our silos. We've said that for 50 years. Why aren't we doing it? What is your recommendation for getting the thread through the different agencies, through the global mechanisms? And I'm going to come back to the issue of the global mechanism, because that's going to be a centerpiece for the HMNDP. How are we coordinating across UNCCD, UNDRR, Sendai, and others, Paris and others? So, to the panelists, who wants to leap that hurdle on how we scale up and how we finance it? Good. Anybody in the audience? Right, these are tough questions. Yes, I have someone there.
Hi, my name is Amanda. I mean, I don't have an answer for this question. It's an age-old question, but I think one thing that we're starting to learn from, and we see it in the tech sector, is recognizing that we have a lot of hierarchy in how we go about solving problems. And we assume that just because you've been in the space for a long time, that you have the best answer. But maybe part of that solution is talking to people who are younger or not as high up in the ranks as others, and letting decisions be made from below, and also maybe letting decisions be made from those who are on the ground rather than those who are up top, or at least letting them be part of that decision process.
Very good answer from the standpoint of input. I'm going to get you promoted tomorrow so that you move into the other category. So, good answer, right? So it's a scale issue in terms of how we're interacting. We know early warning system saves lives, 10 times the value. We know investments in better dryland farming can save us money. Knowing the finance isn't enough. So how do we integrate across the sectors? What is stopping us, and how can we do it? Who do I have? Who's volunteering to solve this problem? Stefan's. Oh, wow, we have a lot of hands up there. Are you saying stop?
No, I'm saying I can quickly, if you hear me okay. But the issue is, I think, internally into the countries, and trying to break, some of these silos between the different ministries, the Met services, et cetera. And that's, one thing that we've done in the past. I know I used to work for the US government, is giving everybody credit within a national agency. So giving the Weather Service credit, giving the Ministry of Agriculture credit. It seems like a very simple thing, but when ministries see that they're included and recognized, even by logos, I mean, Roger and Mark know this, the US Drought Monitor, and also in Brazil, they put the logos of all the agencies. That's actually quite powerful, showing that they're working together. So that's one idea. Over.
Good. No, it's actually an excellent response. The one way we've seen cross-agency, cross-sectoral things work is not to say everybody integrate and then solve the problem, but underwrite the goals and the values of each one. Who's in monitoring and forecasting? Who's in risk assessment? How do we support what they're doing, and then aligning it? That's actually a practical answer. Who do we have up? Adam?
Thanks, Roger. I hesitated to volunteer to answer because you asked about finance, and that scared me away.
Yeah, I know. That's why I added it.
To keep me away. The one thing that I guess I keep reflecting on when it comes to the challenge of breaking out of these silos is that, to use a very messy metaphor, we have a medium-sized hammer. Most governance solutions are set at that sort of middle level of hammer, and we're looking for medium-sized tools. We're looking for the kinds, or medium-sized problems or nails. We're looking for solutions, that policies that can be developed by ministries or governments or even international organizations like the UN can work on. And I think that actually just reinforces those silos. It reinforces those structures that are basically industrial age institutional concepts. I think the way that the most successful ways that I've seen this breakdown happening is to zoom way out and go values-based, very big picture, let everybody participate in that at a values-based level, macro objective level, or zoom way in and focus on really punctual, to sort of use to misuse the French, very specific, very local problems, and get very narrow. Because I think we've really saturated and tried very hard to break these silos at this middle level, and our medium-sized hammer is getting tired. I'll avoid the finance question altogether.
No, Adam, you're pointing to something here, right? Which is that the opportunities lie in increasing the systematic alignment of some of those global strategies, as well at the local level. We're going to come back to that as a goal for the HMNDP. We've got many parallel processes here through UNDR, through the SDGs, through Paris and other things. The question is, do issues of drought, and more importantly, do issues of risk reduction cross all of them? And that's an opportunity for alignment. I think I had Cohen.
Yeah, thanks so much, Roger. Actually, following up on your point you just made, is that actually there is an opportunity, I think, for streamlining water and drought risk management into the reporting to the UNFCCC and also the Paris Agreement requirements. So I think there is this push for identifying who's already streamlining those management strategies into the national adaptation planning. And of course, that means that if that is done properly, and there is a new tool called the Water Tracker to look into where it is already happening, it allows for climate finance to follow, because if those elements are taken into account, then of course finance through the different financing mechanisms, GCF and others can follow that lead. So I think this is indeed talking to that point you just made. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that a great deal in terms of alignment. Mark?
Yeah, Bob touched on attribution. I think that was a good one. The other one we've seen, I think, in the countries I've seen where it's tended to get traction and grow are those countries that have the right kind of champion that is inclusive enough to include all those groups in a participatory process. So that champion can tend to find ways to avoid the political landmines and work through the system of that particular political climate of that country or entity, whether this is a basin or a community, in order to get things done. So I think I would put champion in there and inclusiveness to make it a participatory process. That way there's ownership and transparency and buy-in by the locals up to the, not just top down, but bottom up and top down.
And on the point of inclusiveness, my fellow countrywoman, Rihanna.
Hi, thanks, Roger. And I think what I'd like to say is actually kind of combining what all have said for the previous speakers, because I have a lived example in terms of how governments and ministries have actually come together on, well, drought, but also flooding issues, climate change issues, in terms of creating blended financing across ministries because of the limited budget between one ministry. So rural development with sustainable development with environment and so forth, they had an issue because of, and it was probably very reactive as well because of a drought, water scarcity, and they came together and joined their financing, joined their budgets because of the shared goals. They had to supply water, and that's water security to the population, and that in turn kind of catalyzed this joint integrated approach across our disaster preparedness, across our environment and these different ministries. And this was actually pushed by internal champions within our water authority. Because of actually a young person's innovation to pull together the real-time monitoring systems and create a platform that could go across all of these entities. And when speaking on scale, because it worked, it is now decided to kind of go expand across the Caribbean. So it's interesting how when you have a champion and usually in response to a disaster that it moves faster. So it's kind of bringing all of this together. And I think someone mentioned before the hierarchy. I think it was from one of the audience members. That is actually it's very much an impediment for decision making. And we have to, I think decision makers have to kind of put their egos behind them and realize who they're working for and the reason why they are in the positions that they are in. So I think it's a collaboration and integration of all that was said before.
Great, no, very much appreciated. And you're pointing to something that was said by Amanda as well. Now there's an issue. I'm from a village of 400 people. Lots of young people who want to do stuff. A lot of people want to be engaged, but they don't have the wherewithal to do it, right? So it's not just about engagement. It's actually, we decentralize practices and we don't also decentralize the support to help people act. And I want to make sure that we're making that point about capacity. So in an effort to begin to round us up here and wrap us up with comments, I do want to mention a couple things. You've been hearing the technological and risk management approaches are available, but in large part being used to address short-term risks, right? But we want a continuum. It's not just about resilience or risk, it's the continuum, because we need to address today as well, in addition to the long term. That's a difficult thing to finance. System governance becomes extremely important in developing shared visions that actually aren't about power. Now, that's an easy thing for someone to say, and yet we're all ourselves subject to the illusions about power. What's our goal here? To reduce risk, right? To reduce the propagation and the stocks of risk. These risks are not emerging, they're submerged. They're simply waiting to be exposed. And I want to make sure that we're keeping this in mind, that it's not simply about responding to climate change, but it is actually changing the things that led us to climate change. And that's much more fundamental from a resilience standpoint. So the harmonized implementation strategy. Our takeaway message, we need a modernized view of drought. Of all the things you just heard, the most difficult one of these is that issue of hierarchy and the issue of ecosystems. The ecosystem is still an afterthought in our systems because it is the externality. It is where we socialize the losses. So what are we after? We want to get proactive risk-based management and prospective resilience-based management. But critically, Mami Mitsutori and others hold our feet to the fire. How do you make governance work in a complex environment? The knowledge gaps, the coordination challenges, the valuation challenges, the role of ecosystems and social inclusion. So we want to keep these in mind and produce public value, not just private goods, in a sense to show that resilience has a marketplace and resilience is also a public good on the level of other things we come to think of as public goods, health, water, energy, and so on, because our future depends on it. Additional last comments. We're looking for your help. I'm being very direct about this. We're struggling with these questions. I can point to them, I can diagnose. As Mark has heard me say many times, early warning by itself is like taking your car to the mechanic and she says, I couldn't fix your brakes, so I fixed your horn. We need people who can help us with the engine and the brakes, right? Not just the horn. Any other wrap-up quick comments from the gang? And we have Daniel.
Not a wrap-up, but I just wanted to say that having worked for...
A wrap. Okay.
So I think we need to sensitize governments. The political will is also a huge challenge because drought is not that sexy enough because it comes every 2 years or 3 years. Now it's coming almost every year. So that's one of the things that we need to work on. And the innovative financing that the lead from Ethiopia also mentioned is very, very important. And the coordination and communication and trying to communicate in time. That's very, very important for us. So yeah, we really enjoyed this session.
That was
very
rhythmic
well.
like a rap, not just a wrap up. All right. So to end, we're not just interested in going down to the last mile, but interested in what is coming up from the last mile. Whose capabilities are being derived, and how are we undermining the very ecosystem buffers on the planet that actually are the things that are really fundamentally not letting our risk management practices be realized. So let's keep this in mind. That's what we're going after in terms of the HMNDP. Everybody talks about transformation. It's easy to recommend, very difficult to do. And we want to take that to heart. So if I can get the last slide right here. There are things leading up to the water conference, UNFCCC COP27, CBD, COP15, a bunch of regional consultations on the things we've done over the years. We need your help in making people aware. Things only happen when both the public and leadership are engaged. We move towards the HMNDP +10 conference, and we're asking ourselves honestly, what did we do? What difference did we actually make? And how can we move forward in a way that takes those things into account? Not simply rediscover that participation matters, but mean it. Not simply rediscover that the environment matters, but mean it. With that, I'm going to close the session. Thank you all for coming, but it's more than that. We need your help. Thanks a lot. Cool.